So within hard edge painting, there are several kinds of categories, several kinds of styles that you could consider, from the simplistic and to the complicated. And I guess one of the more complicated, in a certain sense, would be optical art. The idea that the hard edge geometries can give you a dazzling, vibratory, almost seasickness if the paintings are big enough, and you can fill the periphery of your vision with these things. You end up seeing pulsating geometries that are hard for your eye to comprehend. And I think it has that case with the the optical art painting. We're looking at painting that almost tried to challenge the media, the dynamism, the commercialism, the lights, the neon, the pace of contemporary life back in the late 50s and 60s. So one territory of hard edge painting is to do such a precise and repetitive and strongly colored design that it becomes active in your eye and becomes almost kinetic. And because hard edge painting was a kind of reaction to abstract expressionism of the 50s, 40s, and 50s, you end up with it being kind of classical, restrained, rational, geometric in a kind of perfectionist sense. So there were a lot of theories around that had painting trying its best to do away with anything resembling a space, anything resembling a picture, certainly, anything resembling a kind of illusion. Okay, so that's one strain of formalist hard edge painting, and that the truth of the painting, the ethical quality of the painting, and the aesthetic quality of the painting was how it repeated. It didn't try to be anything but a kind of repetition reinforcing the surface of the canvas and the rectangle of the canvas. Okay, a slight alteration of that formalist, that perfection within rectangles and rectangles, was rubbing up against illusion. In other words, very often the hard edge paintings would suggest a kind of space, suggest a kind of relief structure, suggest a kind of in and out illusion, but would always deny it, would always sort of throw things in there that wouldn't make it a complete Renaissance space or a complete, kind of illusionistic relief or perspective space. So this idea of hinting at illusion and then sort of contradicting it in some way, set up a tension in the painting, set up a kind of not confusion, but a not hard to grasp um, design structure that was allegedly, kind of seductive and involving when you're looking at it. Okay, with this one here, there is a bit of a contradiction. There is a bit of a confusion in these being rays in space, light radiating from some point, but it's also almost a kind of very straightforward light and dark fan-like structure. Where one side of this element of light and dark blue, is reinforced in its lightness and darkness by the darker red and the lighter red. So you end up with something of a perceptual three dimensionality, a kind of texture, but it still follows that rule, okay, of trying to fit within the canvas in a kind of even way, in a kind of geometry that reinforces the idea of the rectangle. Okay, this one is more outright an illusion. There are some contradictions in it, but I love the way that things slip behind other things. There's not a perfect logic to it all, but it plays a game with things being flat on a surface, with there being flat color, but also with almost a kind of field in back that seems like more of a deep space than some of the others. One of the aspects of hard edge painting that I've not mentioned so far is that very often the canvases are shaped. We don't have too many in these examples, but you can see how with your two panels, with your 11 by 14 canvas panels, you can arrange things so that they can be jogged or turned round. For instance, this particular painting works very well if that neutral diagonal that seems to go across most of the rectangle is put upright, is put up vertical, but nonetheless it's a little bit moved and jogged and irregular in its shape right here. And the other aspect is that with those two panels, you are free to move it around more extreme than this one. You know, jog them, put them at angles, and your design would incorporate that strange shape or the possibilities of other strange shapes within that format. So yes, be free to move it out of the pure rectangular, tight, continuous rectangle. And secondly, this one is a good example of how you can somehow escape the straight line. There is a way to handle your tape, either through cutting it on the canvas like a stencil or cutting out thin strips of tape, putting them up against a curved surface, it'll be in the demonstration, and backing it with more tape so that you're essentially getting a kind of mask, a kind of stencil, a kind of edge that can be sealed with your gel medium, as we'll talk about, and you're not limited to straight lines. Continuing options of how to approach this. Again, these things are very individual. They don't have to be formulaic. They don't have to be a precise cookbook of shapes. But here you see that these sticks, these long bluish forms, get overlapped and intersected. And while it's not necessarily an exact blending of the colors that go together, there's an implication, there's a kind of feeling, an illusion of there being intersecting, translucent, on top of one another in a narrow space. So that's a little bit of energy you can put into this kind of allegedly geometric and precise hard edge format. And another transparency here, smaller forms, and brighter color. So it's the previous one was sort of somber and bluish and gray. This one here is more party time with bubbles. And you notice that in this one it's pretty straightforward and logical, that the color on top is sort of mixed with the color underneath, a kind of lightness with the bubbles and circles, and you end up with a kind of distribution of transparent form. It also begs the question of how the heck you get such small circles as a form to mix those transparencies. And there are a couple of ways to do it. I think that at that scale, where they're an inch or two across, what I would do is lay down a couple of pieces of tape or 3 pieces of tape, or if you have wider tape, lay that down. And then with your X-Acto knife, after drawing it carefully, your X-Acto knife, cut out that sort of circle, take the interior away, press it down again to make sure that it's fast against the canvas, and then use your gel medium and paint in that kind of stencil. You've made your own stencil if you do that. Since our last assignment was that limited palette still life, and this one is the one that allows you to pick and choose and mix and create with all the colors in your kit. A word or two about color choices, a word or two about the way you put things together. I'd prefer you not to use too many, if any, colors right out of the tube. We'll have a little demonstration, but the idea that you can play with intensity changes, value changes, hue changes in some format of your own design becomes a good format for you to experiment with color. So I'm not laying down any formulas, but you are free to invent your own color, and it's a combination of the technical ability to to mix the color you're heading for. It doesn't have to be precise in every instance. And also, you're juxtaposing, you're putting them together, you're aligning them in ways that makes it both, in a weird way, harmonious. It sort of holds together as a design, like a quilt, whatever, and also has enough contrast to keep it lively, to keep it moving, to keep it interesting to look at. The style of abstraction, this whole territory of painting that is not only hard edge but any kind of abstraction that's not a copy or a photographic likeness of what's in the real world, brings up the issue of where you get your shapes. I mean, they can be intuitive, they can be frenzied and brushstroked, in other kinds of painting. But in abstract hard edge painting, you may think about something in the real world that might be a metaphor, something in the real world that might be a starting point to bash around and make your own, so that it's not terribly recognizable, but at the same time, it's a starting point to develop an interesting composition. So with me, this one here, yes, it's very colorful, it's very abstract. There's a great space with overlapping in here, but to me it becomes almost a kind of mechanical circuitry, a computer chip, a kind of right-angled labyrinth of form that becomes something mysterious and not just a copy from the real world, but is maybe initiated, inspired by something from the real world. And we were indeed talking about inspiration and starting points. These next two paintings, this one included, were done by people from West Africa, and they were very much inspired by the color, by the textile patterns, by a kind of palette, a choice of color that that are reminiscent of their traditions. So very organic, geometric, but not absolutely symmetrical or perfect in terms of a plaid or a checkerboard or a design that is perfect. A particular kind of palette in this one, which is created with almost analogous colors. Blues and purples and grays, a little accent of pinks and some warm colors in there, but it almost becomes, and this in some ways is an interesting issue in abstraction, the word decorative, the word pleasant to the phrase pleasant to the eye, decorative, a kind of wallpaper orientation to your design. This isn't quite that, it's much more sophisticated, but there are pleasing and harmonious things going on in here. So although we've seen some things that are jarringly optically violent in some way, like the op art pieces at the very beginning, this is almost the opposite, where it's a kind of massage and pleasant peacefulness to your eyes. Here you see a really obvious and well done juxtaposition of the two canvases together, with their split and sort of piled on top of one another. But the accuracy of the geometry, the sort of joyous, almost Art Deco, funny phrase from early 20th century, about an architectural style and a decorative style, sort of 20s, 30s streamlining of architecture, kind of modernism that almost associates itself with arches and searchlights and a kind of a clean architectural style. Along with that, I think the color contrasts in this are quite sophisticated and successful. There's just the right amount of breakup of detail and large expansive places and spaces that make it work quite well. And talking about color, the contrasts in this are pretty much relegated, pretty much focused on those triangles and symmetrically arranged around the center. A beautiful warm background and cool blue-green, green-blue contrast with the triangles, and that wonderful mixed after image of a shadow almost a darker, duller version of the yellow ochre in back that becomes a border around the triangles themselves. The issues in this one, the things to consider in this one, uh, are one, the spectacular work ethic, that there was a care and organization and quality to the complexity that that is quite extraordinary. And these are two panels together. In this case, 2 by 2 are vertical, and you get a kind of two figures with outstretched arms. I'm just grasping for metaphors here. But then this gentleman who did this played around with doing it end to end, and there are many ways that these two pieces can go together. This end to end piece is really almost a mask. It's almost a kind of eyes with horizontal lines across the surface of the painting, and I'm just reinforcing the idea that you can put these in any direction, and that you have the opportunity to almost like a sectional set of furniture in your living room. You can move it around and reconfigure it, in many different ways. Although the obvious imagery here comes from a kind of Valentine's Day a heart, it's invested with so much care about color, so much individual effort and complexity, and yet harmony in the mixing of the color. The simple outside stripes versus the more crystalline sort of breakup of the heart inside are just spectacular. I didn't ask her whether or not it was about a broken heart, but indeed it's a kind of shattered cubism inside and more of a kind of formalist stripe on the outside. And on occasion, the most sincere and hardworking and earnest student breaks me down, wears me down in terms of the absolute prescription of the assignment, and this is obviously one of them, where the craft of the hard edge is beautifully done. There's exquisite and incredibly complex color mixing, but it's a representational image. It's a kind of Southwest highway, not done precisely photographically, so it's semi-abstract. I like the idea that the mountains are simplified into triangles, that the sunset is a kind of radiation of light and spectra up above, that the passing marks in the highway are sort of awkwardly, wonderfully at different angles. So I don't want to open the door entirely to this, but I am human and respect a kind of motivation if it takes something that is semi-real, an image that attracts you, like the heart, like this highway, and that becomes the motivation to do the hard edge. Chase it through, but it should indeed have this quality. This assignment of hard edge painting is the first time you're sort of set free on all your colors, especially the 6 primary and secondary colors that you have in your kit. Now, the choice of those colors, the ordering of those colors, was based on their intensity, which means their strength, their saturation, their purity, and their mixability. So what you have first off here, if we align them as the spectrum might be in physics, you have purple, which is a violet, and it's a. If you notice when it is taken out of the tube and put on the palette, you've got something that looks awfully like black, right? There's not too much difference between it seems, and the Payne's gray that you've been using. And the blue, if we're going down the line with the spectrum, is a cerulean blue. It is sort of a sky blue. It is not too dark, not too light in value, and it's very mixable with the other primary and secondary colors. The next one is permanent green, light, a kind of warm green, but that's what you want when you're mixing it. A cadmium yellow, which is this is cadmium yellow light, and it is indeed a light yellow that is very intense. A cadmium orange, which is very warm and intense, and a strangely labeled red called pyrrole red, which I've found to be very mixable with the other primary and secondary colors. Now, along with those, I'm not inviting you to do a lot of this mixing, but if indeed you want a straightforward darkness to your color, you're welcome to use your Payne's gray, knowing that it's going to make it a little bit cooler, but nonetheless mostly dark if you put even a small amount in it. And the ever popular big tube of titanium white that you have, in fact, if indeed partway through the semester, you end up getting very low in this may be the one color that you may have to run out and replenish. You may get away with a smaller tube, but watch your quantity, and you may have to go to the art store and get titanium white. And for now, for this particular assignment, I'm not asking you to include the mixture of your limited palette. I think yes, the Payne's gray was our blue with the titanium white, but the Terra Rosa and the yellow ochre, those can be mixed reasonably well with neutrals of these colors that are in front of us. There are two color qualities that I want to consider demonstrating. They're not the only color qualities, obviously. There'll be a list in your assignment message, but there are two things that often become confused when you are starting out. One is value, and the other is intensity. Okay, and in certain straightforward definitions, the value is that quality that describes lightness and darkness. And there are all sorts of ways to do that, but the most straightforward way and the most pure way would be to, as we've done with the purple, to add white to the color. Let me add a little bit more white to make this kind of middle value red. I'm also going to do the same thing with the green. I'm going to get it out to, as best as possible, a value, which is simply the fancy art word for lightness and darkness, to a value that hopefully is close to, if not identical to, the red. That will need more. Let's see. We'll have to check it against the red that's here. Now, I'm doing these things to demonstrate color qualities, not for you to copy in terms of your own personal color in the hard edge painting. This could go a little bit lighter. I don't want that to happen. Okay, there. So, darkness to lightness, value. Brightness, in other words, the absolute saturation and strength of the color, the strength of the color, the purity of the color, the redness of the red, is is controlled by, what's out of how bright it is out of the tube. That's a fairly intense red. It's become lighter here, but not necessarily less red in terms of its hue quality. But with intensity changes and color mixing, you are playing with the complements of colors together. In other words, there is the color wheel with the primary and secondary colors in sequence, like the spectrum going round. And with that configuration opposite one another are the complements. That's complements, I spent years mixing up the spelling, but the complements with an LE as opposed to an LI, complements with an LE are those colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel. And they happen to be in pairs, as you no doubt know from any other kind of color mixing class before. In pairs, they are red and green, orange and blue, and yellow and purple. Now look what happens, ironically, when you place those two things together. They kill each other, they neutralize their strength, they weaken each other. In fact, if you were to have the right intensity and value of two complements, you could actually, I've seen professionals do this, you could, I'm coming close to it here, you could come close to a pure gray. You could come close to an achromatic gray. But what you usually get is a kind of brown, a kind of color that is neutral and brownish and earthy, and those can be either warm or cool depending on if you're dealing with complementary colors that are both warm and a cool color. You can emphasize either the warmth or the coolness of that. So here the red becomes less red by way of its getting lighter. Here the red and the green become in equal parts something close to an absolute neutral, because they have mixed together and sort of done away with each of their intensities. So when it becomes something that is dull, quote unquote, in official art lingo, that is called a neutrality. So it's intensities versus neutralities. And I just throw that in to invite you to do, not require you, but to invite you to do color sections of your hard edge that might not be just blazing intensities or right out of the tube intensities and darkness. So this is way too logical. It's something you're probably familiar with painting the interior of your room or any kind of painting situation where you have to be accurate, but we're taping things off. And I would recommend that you get either artist tape from an art supply store, or perhaps less expensive but just as useful, a hardware store, paint store, masking tape. I would just, you don't have to avoid it completely, but I would advise not getting the bright blue tape or the bright green tape. It just gets in the way of seeing your color as you're putting it down. It's not an absolute necessity. If you have the blue and or the green, that's okay. It's just that you're not going to see the true colors that are going on until you take that tape off. So I've done a very simple triangle here, and without too much fuss, I'm simply putting the tape around it. And the trick is, in this particular hard edge painting, one way to I won't say guarantee, but make more certain that you end up with a precise shape is to take what is your gel medium from your kit, which is really used for something else that we'll talk about later on in another assignment. But with your finger or with a small brush, smear a thin layer of that gel medium across the border, across the boundary of the tape and the canvas. Don't work it too much but keep it quickly applied and smooth. You could use a small brush for it, but I find unless you bathe your fingers in the acrylic, which is not so great, if you're doing it quickly, it's not going to harm anything, and it becomes a quick way to smooth it, put it on, and give a seal. What this is done for, since it's acrylic, since it's plastic, it goes across that border, and when it dries, and you don't really do much until it dries, when it dries, it forms a kind of plastic seal over the edge of the tape, so that the chances are that the paint, no matter what quality the tape, whether it's hardware store or artist tape, that you have, when you take it off, after you applied the paint, obviously, when you take it off, you have a clear, crisp, precise edge. You'll notice in some few of the examples in the video that there are some forms that are circular or curved, and the way to handle that, a couple ways, but the most straightforward, if it's not too small a circle, would be for you to take a length of masking tape or your paint store tape, and with an X-Acto knife, I know you don't have one in your kit, but with a mat knife, with any kind of really sharp blade, I'm asking you to do what seems to be a thin strip. I've got about maybe a little over 1/8 of an inch. Don't have to be that fussy. It depends on the size of your circle. But I'm cutting a strip off this and lifting it up carefully. And with that, not too long a strip, I mean, you have to shorten this, you are able to, you don't have to get it right away, but lead it into the circle and then begin to place it next to the curve of that circle. And it's going to pucker. It's going to ripple a little bit, especially since this seems to be a tighter circle and a wider tape than might want to go together. And don't try to bring it too far. Once you've got a small amount, press it down so that those ripples, those creases, those constrictions that are happening to the tape don't become caves and holes through which the paint can leak. And as you can see, I'm not trying to do the whole length of tape right around. You can have it spin off like some kind of trajectory, some kind of tangent to the circle. But then what you do, and it doesn't really matter if I don't think you have to start with the pure straight edges of the tape. I think since we're curving it, it does not seem that crucial that you have the perfect commercial edge of the tape, but that you just take either side of this tape and place it along the curve. And I'm going to move this around just for my easier handling. There I go. And notice that I've, maybe cleverly, I hope, made the tape a little bit more thin, at least initially, so that it may be a little bit easier to go around this circle. Now I would advise probably, if you're using curves, that you go for curves that might be a little bit larger than this. It just makes it easier for the tape to go around it. But I'm just going to keep this going. Maybe on this side. And what I've done for that particular circle, not surprisingly, and if you've got a compass, fine, you can control the diameter and circumference of your circle very easily. But I find that if you can grab around the house, the kitchen, the workshop, cans, glasses, cups, lids of any kind that might be more wide in diameter. You're welcome to use those larger circles because they become a little less difficult to do. I'm just going to have that go on. I'm not worried about wasting strips of tape. Let's try to do this a little bit thinner. Now, you may not have a cutting board, which is another problem. But if you find any kind of non-porous, not too valuable surface to put the tape down, you can use that. I find that the back of an old ruler that's relatively clean, or the back of a piece of plastic, or a piece of plastic that's scrap that you have lying around, that works reasonably well to be able to serve as a surface on which to cut your tape. And it's not worth trying to untangle that tape right there, so I'm just going to cut it off. I'll just have it go off to the side. And you'll say, well, am I supposed to paint up to this minimal kind of width here, this thin thread of tape, and keep the paint within that margin? No, you don't have to do that. You can back it with, as I'll do in a moment, you can back it with further tape, more tape, that will give you more of a zone of overflow or overpainting, so that you don't have to be that picky. Now, if you're really careful, precise, kind of very, very immaculately working and careful person, you could use the thinnest and smallest, the number 1 soft brush of your kit to do exactly what I'm doing. You'd have to do the edges first, and then, just as you're painting the walls in your house, roll on the larger, or shall we say brush, with our case, brush on the larger areas of paint as you move away from that initial border that you'll put in. There we go. Now, there's no reason you have to use a curve, but I'm just giving you the option not to be stuck with straight lines. I'm rolling something on top of the tape to make sure that all the creases are sort of right down on the canvas. And what I talked about before is obviously pretty easy to do. You just rip off a lot of different pieces. If you back that tape, keep that very accurate curve that you've just created with the tape, but go around with larger pieces, you then have a fairly safe zone against which to paint the larger area of your form. And while I'm doing this busy work, I could say things like, I could remind you that if you're doing larger areas of the hard edge color, it takes a bit of experimentation and figuring, but you need to mix as much as you need in an area. In other words, it's plain English and more efficiently. What I'm trying to say is that mix the amount of color you need in each area, because it's very, it's often difficult to get back to that original color, and therefore you'll end up with two sort of graded colors within the point of the hard edge, the areas of absolutely inhuman perfection of mixed color that's all the same across the surface. So that's a little pointer. The other pointer is that if you've got in one or two of the canvases, or across both, you've got a lot of one color showing up behind things, or being a part of a pattern that's fairly large, but that color shows up in a great amount. I would suggest, even though it is a little bit, tiny bit wasteful, that you mix up that color and put it across the canvas in which it appears, and then paint on top of it. With the tape, with the gel medium, you can always, as with any kind of acrylic, you can paint upon paint. You can, as long as it's dry underneath, you can make adjustments and differences in color as you layer it, as you change it, as you decide to make it another color. So mix up the right volume. And also another tip, like a chef here giving you tips, but another tip, and what you couldn't see in the videos, is that with the hard edge to canvas thingy, you're going to be putting them together, but also you're going to be seeing this edge around the canvas. Paint whatever color is on top around that edge. Don't leave it white, because if you do this marvelous kind of perfection on the surface and it's hanging on the wall or pinned to the wall, you will see this kind of whiteness, which is likely to be irregular in its edge to the front flat surface. So the easiest thing to do, and it also makes it a little bit more continuous and sort of an object rather than a picture, to paint around the edges with whatever color is in front. So I'm going to take our circle here and do the same thing I did with the triangle. I'm being a little bit nervous and repetitive with making sure that those little creases that occur when you do the thin tape on the surface are as close as possible to the surface of the canvas, that they're tight, that there's no holes in them, okay? I'm likely to not be absolutely perfect, but by and large, I want that to be as tight as possible. And I'm doing the same thing I did with the triangle, and that is putting on an amount of gel medium. And I should, in truth, in advertising here, this is not the main reason you have the gel medium kit. Didn't have you buy all this to just do taped up edges. We will be using these in the next assignment, which is Abstract Expressionism. It is the more loose, the more gooey, the more layered, the more chaotic, at least initially in your perception, kind of painting that actually historically preceded the hard edge. The Abstract Expressionism was pretty much 1940s and 50s, and hard edge painting began late 50s and through the 60s, and so both of these strains still continue, and it's really a kind of 20th century and even 21st century continuation of what might be called Romanticism and Classicism. Those of you who study literature or have any idea of what those words might mean. I used to teach it a lot in high school literature and college literature. But Romanticism is the reliance and expression of emotion. It's all passion. It's all action. It's all a kind of emotional honesty that spills itself, in this case, out onto the canvas. With these, it's more classic, right? It's more classicism. It is more that rational, plotted, planned harmony that comes more from geometry and understandable rational forms than individual handwriting and brushstroke. So I'm just personally, arbitrarily mixing a color, enough of that color, to put in the triangular area. I'm gonna, for the sake of demonstration and visual power, I'm going to make it fairly bright. So it is springtime yellow-green. This may turn out to be a combination of paint. They're all different by their tubes, by their given colors, but some paints are going to be more opaque than others, even in your mixtures. Some are going to cover quickly and thoroughly and smoothly with one coat. Others are going to be needing a couple of coats, and there's no problem with that. I have to tell you that this gel medium has to dry there on the edges of the tape and the canvas for at least a half an hour. Make sure it's dry, because if it's tacky at all, if it's wet at all, it's not going to be that sealant that holds out the paint, holds back the paint from seeping into the canvas. And I've mixed up enough of this color, I'm hoping, to place in that rectangular form. And the best, for the hard edge painting, the best way to lay things in is not simply back and forth in one direction, but in multi-directions with lots of paint. So essentially you're sort of evening out a texture. There will be a texture, there will be a bit of a brushstroke left there. But if you keep that brushstroke in one direction, it tends to look like you've painted the barn door with broad brushes of a given color, rather than an even, almost airbrushed color, which is what we're after. For this particular kind of painting, as difficult as it might be sometimes, you're after a color surface that seems to be inhumanly even and flat, solid. So the multi-brush strokes still give you a texture, but because they're in different directions, they sort of cancel each other out in the light. And now the circle, which is pretty much the same operation. You may start at the edge, as long as you make that edge as flat and as textureless as the rest of the shape. I see a little bit of lifting and texture on the tape, which may give us a problem, but we'll see in the end. And back and forth. You can use a slightly bigger brush, but I find that the bigger brushes very often can leave you with a bigger, less controlled texture. If we had all the money and the time in the world, you could get a whole set of sable brushes, the wide sable brushes that would put this stuff on immaculately. But your kit's bristle brush pack, and I'm using a number 4, should work well. And that, to me, in this light, looks like it's fairly even. So we've determined that the color itself is dry, and although I only put one coat on these, you need to put as many coats as possible to make it a kind of even surface. If you have an X-Acto knife or some kind of thin knife that can pull up the end without ripping the tape, it's good. And I find that if you go slowly and away from the paint itself, you end up with a more pristine and an accurate line. I'm going to do this one here. Sorry. pulling away slowly. If you rip it off, you might mar and pull some of the stuck paint, but be as slow and careful as possible. We're doing okay. And again, slow and away. Might have a little bit of bump there, but slow and away, slow and away. And if you've got paint down there already, this is the same. It's the same procedure. If I'm painting over paint, if I have a paint, if I'm about to paint something next to this, I would simply tape that area off. Excuse me, and I would tape right over the paint that I've just exposed with the tape. So let me continue. Again, let's see how the circular one did. I had some reservations about the crimps in the tape, the small thin tape that we put around the circle, but let's see how it works. And you may end up doing something separate from the actual tape. Let's see, is it the tape that's underneath? No, the tape underneath is still there, so I'm going to do that. That's not the actual edge. This is the actual edge. Sometimes they will come off together. A little bit of roughness that I think I can take with an X-Acto knife and clean up. That may be just flaked tape from the paint from the tape. We'll check it out. So, a little less perfect. These seem like things that were on top of the tape, many of them. Yeah. So just be careful picking of some of this stuff. And it will get back to that pristine edge. I think this may be something that just went through a hole in the tape. And if it becomes too ridiculous to put a tape inside, what you can do is whatever forms are on the outside, use your small #1 soft brush and go up against this, and you'll be able to clean it up relatively easily. So not quite. I don't know if I can keep on this. This stuff is coming off a little bit. I just have to be very careful and very slow at picking off this excess. I think what you do is when you're putting on a curved tape, one, it will work better if you're dealing with a form that's a little bit larger circle or arc than this, and then secondly, if you're doing the outside, as I said, use your small #1 brush to come up against it.